we'll be hearing about monitoring oak woodland wildlife communities following the Mendocino complex fire. And our presenter is Kendall Calhoun. And this webinar is actually the third in a series of 4 in the Terrestrial Biodiversity and Climate Change Collaborative, also known as TBC3, Winter Webinar Series. So this series' theme is of wildlife and wildfire, biodiversity monitoring and management in fire-adapted landscapes. This is hosted by Pepperwood in partnership with the Conservation Biology Institute and TBC3. So we'll also drop links in the chat to those different organizations so you can learn more about them. And a little background on the goals of this webinar series. We sort of have 3 main objectives. We want to first share findings from wildlife monitoring in the California Coast Ranges, examples of how reptiles, amphibians, and mammals respond to wildfires. Second, we want to explore the role of key factors like habitat type and quality, climate, and land use in understanding patterns. And lastly, we want to identify research gaps or stewardship actions that can benefit wildlife and increase fire resilience. So if you'd like to take a look at the past webinars that have already happened in this series, you can find those on our YouTube channel as well. And Pepperwood is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to inspire conservation through science. Even though we are not physically at Pepperwood right now, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Pepperwood Preserve sits within the traditional homeland of the Wapo people. We respect and honor past, present, and future generations of Wapo and their continued connection to this land. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather and work in this beautiful place, and we give our respect to its first inhabitants. And the preserve, Pepperwood Preserve, is 3,200 acres located in Santa Rosa in Northern California. It's home to over 900 species of plants and animals. And this is also where you will find the Dwight Center for Conservation Science, which serves as our home base. We hope you can join us there in person someday. Pepperwood's work can be categorized sort of into 3 main buckets. We conduct research on climate, water, plants, and wildlife, tracking ecosystem health over time. And we share our findings with the larger community and use that to also inform our stewardship of the land. We offer education programs like this one and others for learners of all ages. And last but not least, community is a huge part of our work. We have community science projects and lots of opportunities for volunteers to get involved. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without the support of our donors. So thank you all for being part of our community today. And with that, I would love to introduce Kendall Calhoun. So Kendall's our presenter today and is a PhD candidate at the Brashares Lab in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on understanding the impacts of recent shifts in California's fire regimes on native wildlife communities. Using a combination of biodiversity monitoring techniques, he observes the response and potential recovery of wildlife species to recent extreme fire events. His current fieldwork takes place at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, assessing the impacts of the 2018 river fire on oak woodland mammal and bird communities, using camera traps, acoustic, ultrasonic monitors, and GPS tracking. So that is what we're going to hear about now. I will pass it over to you, Kendall.
Okay, thank you so much, Helen, for the intro. Let me get the screen sharing going. Oh. Okay. Does that look great? Perfect. All right. So yes, thank you again, Holland, for the intro. Today I'll be talking about some of my work looking at how mammal communities mostly are responding to a recent megafire in Mendocino County at the Hopland Research and Extension Center. So I like to start most of my presentations by like setting the stage and kind of sharing a little bit of my own kind of interest and why I'm doing what I'm doing. I came to grad school really interested in biodiversity and community ecology and understanding how wildlife are able to interact in this kind of constantly changing world. And this slide is showing pictures of all kinds of different biodiversity, all taken from the Hopland Research and Extension Center. And I like it because it shows just the sheer breadth of biodiversity that's at the center, but also that covers a lot of the state. And similarly, I like to think of this as like a ensemble movie. Most of my favorite movies are ensemble movies, like The Avengers and lots of other movies. But in the same way, there are a lot of characters that are playing different roles on this landscape. We have jackrabbits, bobcats, coyotes, bugs, birds. Everything is interacting while having their own individual roles to play. Something that's often overlooked is the role that people play in many of these ecosystems. So here's a picture of me on a camera trap. And I put this here just to emphasize that the decisions that people make on or around these landscapes has direct impacts on the ways that these species are able to persist. And this is especially important now as we're facing several types of different global change pressures. I focus my research on wildfire, but this is critical to understanding how these species are able to persist against several different pressures as well, like habitat degradation, deforestation. All of these are tied very intimately with the decisions that we make. So I'll kind of go over a little bit of the outline of what I wanted to talk about today. One, I wanted to touch on how wildfire regimes are changing in California and the implications of these changes for biodiversity and for people. Two, why study wildlife and wildfire ecology at the Hopland Research and Extension Center. It's a great, beautiful place, and I'm excited to share all the photos and all the things I've learned from that center. Three, how are wildlife assemblages changing in response to this 2018 river fire that occurred at Hopland? So this wildfire, the river fire is this kind of the southernmost portion of this much larger wildfire that was at the time the largest wildfire in California history. And then finally, looking specifically at one species, how does their movement responses, black-tailed deer specifically, help them navigate a burned landscape and potentially recover? So zooming way out, I wanted to show kind of the breakdown of what wildfire looks like across the state. So some lab mates and I performed a short analysis that looked at the composition of wildfire in California over the last 20 years. So here on the right, you can see a map of the state. These red outlines are all the megafire perimeters that have burned within the state in the last 20 years. Megafires here being defined as any fire that's larger than 100,000 acres. And we've also broken down all of the fire-prone land cover types into four main categories: conifer, hardwood, grassland, and shrubland. This is kind of encouraged because a lot of the recent debates and conversations about wildfire in California have pointed to forest management as being kind of the premier silver bullet for solving a lot of the state's ongoing wildfire issues. But from doing this analysis, we were able to see that actually, in fact, the large majority of the wildfires that are burning in California are actually in these non-conifer dominated systems. So these three colors on the right, shrubland, grassland, and hardwood combined burn a greater amount than conifer forest in the last 20 years. And this is important because the way that we manage these systems is dependent on the unique kind of unique characteristics of that fire regime specific to that ecosystem type. A lot of the historical fire management tools have come out of forestry, which is great for forested conifer systems, but not so great for a lot of the other systems that are very much present in California. And this is even more important for California, I think, because a lot of the most biodiverse regions of the state are outside of these conifer forests and are instead in shrubland systems and hardwood oak woodland systems. So in order to kind of get ahead of this, escalating wildfire problem, we really need to spend more time learning about these non-forested ecosystems and how wildfire is potentially affecting them and their wildlife. So why study wildfire at the Hopland Research and Extension Center? This is a picture of Hopland on the night of the river fire. So it burned south from the Mendocino National Forest, if you're familiar with the area, into the Hopland Research and Extension Center. I'll show a map in this next one, I think. I wanted to touch on really quickly what the Hopland Research and Extension Center is. So it's about 2 hours north of Berkeley, just off of Highway 101, located near Hopland, just south of Ukiah. It's a kind of a mixed use landscape where we have a combination of sheep rearing, vineyards, lots of other agricultural production, but at the same time, these spaces are being shared by a wide variety of different wildlife species, including like this black bear, deer, lions, like you name it, they're all there, and they're all sharing the same mixed use space. Hopland is also, I think, would be characterized as a wildland urban interface, or a WUI. And WUIs are basically where people and wildland spaces meet. These WUIs are really important, especially in terms of fire ecology, because it's predicted that these WUI areas are supposed to burn more often into the future, because people being closer to these wildland spaces make them more likely to ignite. And in that way, I think Hopland really represents a lot of other parts of California, and the things that we can learn from Hopland, I hope, can help inform research and management in other parts of the state. Also, the staff at Hopland, Allison, Troy, many others who work there, they're all part of the University of California system. They've been just amazing, and they make working there so much fun. And I've had a great time. So this is a map of Hopland. In the bottom left corner, you can see it's dotted in Northern California. Very similarly to what I had mentioned before, Hopland is composed of many different habitat types. So in the north, we have this orange chaparral, and then most of the rest of the property is kind of a mix of oak woodland and grassland. And I think this is cool because it represents in many ways the composition of California overall, minus forests. But in that way, it kind of gives us an idea of what species may be doing in other parts of the state in similar habitat types. So since 2016, before I even joined the lab alumni members outfitted Hopland with a grid of camera traps. So these are remote sensing cameras that take pictures of animals as they walk by. We put 36 cameras, if you can see on this grid. It's like a hexagonal grid. There's 36 cameras, one camera at the center of each grid. And in addition, we also have been monitoring black-tailed deer movements across the property by using GPS collars. So from 2017 till I think 2021, we've deployed GPS collars on deer annually. And this was actually initiated as a collaboration with CDFW to better understand how deer populations may be changing over time, and also to assess the best way to monitor those populations in other parts of the state. So we used a combination of cameras, GPS collars, and also fecal swabs to look at deer populations across the site. So this is the initial idea behind this project, but my project actually took advantage of both the cameras and the GPS collars to look at how deer and other species respond to this fire. So this is the burn perimeter of the river fire, just west of Clear Lake. It burned about half of the Hopland Research and Extension Center. And if you can imagine, there are cameras throughout here. So about maybe half of the cameras got burned by this fire. It kind of creates an interesting controlled experiment, natural experiment for us, because we have half the cameras that have been burned and half that have not. And we can compare how species are using those different spaces and how that may change over time. And just to zoom out so you can see how large this fire actually was, this is the entire Mendocino complex fire. Hopland's down here, teeny tiny in blue. Yeah, this is over 400,000 acres burned into the Mendocino National Forest. And as I said, at the time was the largest wildfire ever recorded in California. But I think that was usurped like the following year, which is just a testament to how this wildfire issue is kind of continuously escalating. And again, why we need to get ahead of it. And I just wanted to show what Hopland looked like right after the fire. So this is me and two of my lab mates going out to look at the site maybe 3 months following. Pretty barren in some of the parts, like a moonscape. And this is me. I think this was a downed tree that had just completely burned to ash. You can see like the ashen remain of the tree. And here's me, just a tiny bean at the top. Okay, so it's important, I think, to think about how wildlife species are dealing with these really dramatic changes to the landscape. So in this section, I want to talk about mostly how I've used camera traps to assess how these species are responding, but I'll also touch on how I'm also using acoustic monitors to look at bird and bat responses and diversity as well. So I think that repeated large high severity fires probably have the potential to have pretty negative impacts on wildlife communities. This could be through mortality for some species that are less mobile, but for many species, this may just mean indirect changes caused by dramatically changed vegetation. For example, oaks are a huge resource for many species in this system. Acorns come in periodic crops, so they're important they're like the food basis for so many species in the system. And then also the species that eat those species that eat acorns are also dependent in that way on the acorns that are produced by oaks. Fires that are severe enough to remove these oaks or kill them could have like severe impacts on animal populations far into the future. And then finally, these large disturbances caused by wildfire may rearrange existing food webs and interactions between these species. For example, if a critical prey species is dramatically affected by wildfire, it may affect not only the animals that eat it, like maybe, I don't know, a lion, but it may also affect the species that it's also interacting or competing with in that ecosystem. So next I want to go over the tools I've been using to kind of look at what some of these potential consequences of wildfire may be. So I mentioned before using cameras. Again, we have a 36-point grid across the entire site. This is me checking one of our cameras this might be a year after the fire. So 36 Reconyx Hyperfire cameras. These cameras are working year round and we check them 4 times a year, so about every 3 months. And this started in 2016 and is actually ongoing. So we have a very long data set to look at, and it actually was recording data through the fire as well. Surprisingly, almost all the cameras survived that fire. As I mentioned before, the fire had burned about half the property, and 25 of those cameras were within that burn perimeter. and 11 cameras were in the unburned area just south. And again, this creates a really cool opportunity to look at how burned versus unburned cameras may be affecting wildlife distributions. So after the fire, I thought it'd be really cool to look at how other species may be responding to these changes in habitat type by using acoustic monitors on top of the existing camera grid. So with each of these camera grid points that were that I showed in that slide before, we've also paired an acoustic monitor. We're using these audio moth units, which are really small, programmable acoustic recorders. If you're looking for an acoustic recorder, I highly recommend these. They're like super easy to use and easy to deploy. We've been sampling the spring season since 2020, following the fire. And so far we have 2 seasons from March till June. And for the acoustic monitoring for birds, we're focusing on sampling the dawn chorus. So this dawn chorus is when most songbirds are singing their, unique characteristic song, especially during the breeding season of spring. And to do this, we're doing 5-minute acoustic snapshots. So we do a 5-minute recording before sunrise, a 5-minute recording at sunrise, and a 5-minute recording after. And then finally, we do 4 mornings of sampling for each grid location to get a kind of total idea of the bird species that may possibly be at that site. And so far, we have about 50 species observed using this acoustic recording protocol. We've been using an automatic classifier called BirdNet, which has been helpful in trying to piece out which species are present. But I'm still kind of working on cleaning up that data, but that will be kind of the next step. And then in addition to the acoustic monitoring, we're also doing ultrasonic monitoring to look at bat diversity at these sites. For this, I'm using the SM mini bat units. And again, these are paired with each camera site across the grid. 25 in the burned area and 11 in the unburned. And again, just like birds, we're sampling in the spring to summer, March through June. And instead of mornings, we're using 4 nights of sampling at each site. And similar to the cameras, it's a triggered recording. So as a bat flies by the recorder and uses its echolocation call, it triggers the recorder to record the ultrasonic call. And each bat species has a unique ultrasonic call that you can use to identify what species it is. We've had over 6,000 accepted and classified calls so far from these last 2 seasons, and have observed 14 species detected total. But just like the birds, I'm currently working on these analyses. So instead, I'm going to talk mostly about what we see on the camera traps. But I wanted to lay out some of our initial analyses again, or sorry, initial hypotheses of what we thought we might see in terms of how species are responding to this recent fire. So 1, we thought that high severity areas, or areas that burned at high severity, would have lower detections of species relative to low severity areas. So fire severity is kind of the measure of how much structural change happens after a fire. So a really high severity fire would burn all the dominant vegetation. So in an oak woodland, it would burn all the oak trees, not just the below ground, but the above ground, or not just the grasses at the foot of the oaks, but the actual oaks themselves. And I think this is very important for particularly prey species who probably need more cover in a lot of these systems to avoid predators, and also potentially specialist species that are dependent on those dominant vegetation types. And if they're removed by high severity fires, those specialist species aren't going to have those resources. And then secondly, I thought that potentially large predators would be less likely to use areas that had burned for a couple different reasons. Specifically for mountain lions, they really need cover to successfully hunt for prey. And if high severity fires remove that cover by removing vegetation, it might make looking or hunting for prey that much harder. Secondly, a lot of these large predators like mountain lions and bears have just huge home ranges. So they have the option to preferentially not use burned areas. They can like take advantage of the portion of their home range that is unburned if they want. And I thought that this might have an indirect effect on other animals like bobcats, skunks, and foxes. With the absence of these large predators, those like mesocarnivores, or the carnivores that are under them, might become more active in those areas because they're not as limited by the presence of those apex predators. So here are some examples of what we're seeing so far. On the left is a plot of the number of detections for each of these species I'll be talking about. So on the y-axis is number of detections on cameras. On the x-axis is time. And I've split the number of detections into two different groups. So this red graph is showing the number of detections only on burned cameras. And this blue graph is showing the number of detections on unburned cameras. And remember that we have 25 burned cameras and only 11 unburned cameras. So we should, if all is equal, we should expect that there are more detections on the burned cameras just because there are more of them. And this is true for deer up until this line, which is the date of the fire. And we can see that it like decreases directly following the fire, and then the year following that peak as well. And it looks like it decreases almost so much that the unburned cameras are getting almost just as many detections of deer as the burned cameras as well. Interestingly, though, it looks like deer detections increase again to their pre-fire levels by, I think this is like 2021, so 3 years following the fire. So in this way, this kind of summary of the data may suggest that deer are vulnerable to fire for the first couple of years following really severe fire events, but they are able to recover potentially 3 years following. Here's another example species, coyote, same plot kind of configuration. We can see that coyotes were detected pretty equally on both sides of the grid until the fire, and then their detections just shoot up like crazy right after the fire. And that may suggest that coyote are preferentially using some of these burned areas. Potentially, the removal of cover may have helped coyote look for prey. There are some caveats that kind of the fire removes a lot of vegetation, and that may make the cameras, it might make it easier to detect a coyote on the camera, which is why we get more detections. But we don't see this pattern for other species. So I think that this is actually a true increase in activity or the number of detections of coyotes directly following the fire. And then our last comparison are our gray squirrels. As you can see before the fire, they have a huge number of detections, and then it crashes like right after the fire and has yet to recover to pre-fire conditions. So those 3 graphs I showed are kind of just a summary of the detections that we've seen. And I'm trying to now use that data to do a more thorough analysis using an occupancy model. So these occupancy models are basically it's a model, a stats model that lets you get a better idea of mammal or animal distributions by kind of taking into account how easy it is to detect the species and then what areas that they're occupying. And we can use this to get a really good idea of where species distributions are changing over time, and also species richness, which is the number of species. So to do this analysis, I've subsetted that data that you saw before only to like a small window per year. So I only look at October and November of 2016, October and November 2017, October, November 2018, the year of the fire. And those pockets of data are giving me kind of like a window of time to compare how species detections may be changing from year to year. And I can, if people want later on, I can talk about more of the details of the model, but essentially I'm doing two types of models. One that has just a single species model for every species that we detected, and then one group model that has all the species put together. And each of these, you're taking into the account the probability of detecting a species and the probability of it occurring at a site. And I have equations for these if people are like really into math, and I can share them later if you have questions, but I'll keep moving. And kind of the purpose I wanted to do, or the purpose of this for me, was to assess how community resistance and resilience to severe wildfire is changing over time. So I'm defining resistance as the degree to which a property or species changes directly following fire. And then resilience as the ability of a species or property to absorb change in order to persist after disturbance. So I would say a species is resistant to fire if their occupancy doesn't change directly after the fire happens, or their presence doesn't change directly after the fire happens. And I would say a species is resilient if its presence may change directly after fire, but it's able to return to its pre-fire occupancy kind of state or presence. So I'm going to share two types of results. So we have our single species occupancy results for each of our species. One point I thought was pretty cool is that most of the species that we observed with this model are resilient to wildfire. So that means that by the time, by 2021, I think, or 2020, sorry, by 2020, most species are using these sites as they would in pre-fire conditions. So the pre-fire and post-fire conditions at the start and beginning of the study are very similar for most species. The only species that had considerable differences were gray squirrel and raccoon. And I think that may be due to them being canopy sensitive, as I put it, or they're very tree dependent. So and a lot of these severely burned areas that removed oaks, even temporarily, I think the gray squirrels and raccoons in these areas are less likely to return until the oaks actually are able to regenerate. And then in terms of resistance, so just a reminder, I'm defining resistance as a species that has no change following the wildfire. I found that a lot, as we kind of expected, a lot of the mesocarnivores are pretty resistant to wildfire. They didn't really change where they were using space following the fire, and they didn't avoid those areas as well. So bobcat, coyote, gray fox. And then the more fire vulnerable species are the species that temporarily left those burned areas, included the large predators like mountain lions and black bear, but then also black-tailed deer, and then our canopy sensitive species like raccoon and gray squirrel. And I think, again, that mountain lions, similarly to gray squirrel and raccoons, may be just avoiding these areas because they also want canopy so that they can actually be successful when they're hunting for prey. Similarly, black-tailed deer may be avoiding these areas because they're more exposed. And I'll talk more about kind of the deer perspective in a little bit. But before that, I wanted to share this as well. I'm going to break this down. So this is the multi-species occupancy result. And this model is looking at how species richness, so like the number of species, changes in response to these wildfire time windows. So on the y-axis, we have the mean number of species, and then these colors are showing whether or not a site has high canopy or low canopy. So in the unburned time window, we see that areas that have high canopy normally have more species. So that's kind of our baseline. This kind of column is showing what happens the year of the fire. So the fire just happened, and it's pretty surprising that the number of species that we observe actually increases that year, but only in areas that have high canopy. So what this is saying is that species richness was highest the year of the fire, but only at sites that maintained canopy, which may mean that low severity fires or high severity fires may be more damaging to some of these, at least communities overall, and less likely to support different types of species. I also think that this means that during the year of the fire, the areas that had high canopy cover probably act as like an attractant for many of the species in the area. And they basically become like canopy islands in this like burned landscape, attracting many different types of species to that one area. And then we also notice that over time, this species richness curve returns back to what it was in the unburned year. So the most dramatic differences seem to happen the first year of the fire and then slowly return to the pre-fire conditions. Okay. So this kind of ends a little bit of the camera trap stuff I was talking about, but I wanted to also mention that I'm really excited to expand some of this research by looking at different sites. Hopland really lets us look at one site through time, which is really useful at getting an idea of resistance and resilience across time. But I think to accurately get at how wildfire severity affects species richness and resilience across the state, we really need to have a wider, broader view of different systems and sites, which is why I'm hoping or have started some collaborations with other sites, including the Hastings Natural History Reserve. This picture down in the corner is Jen Hunter, who's the kind of head of Hastings, who's been just amazing to work with and super fun. And also partnering with Felidae at Henry Coe State Park to look at the effects of the SCU lightning complex fire in that system as well. And I'm hoping that from bringing these different pieces together, we can get a better idea of how these wildfires that affect species distributions trickle down to affect the ecosystem services that those woodlands provide as well. So for the second half of the talk, I wanted to shift gears and kind of zoom in on one species, black-tailed deer, and talk about how their movement and behavioral responses may situate them well to respond to wildfire, at least temporarily. So the big question here is, what is the capacity of deer to adapt to megafire? And we can do this really well at Hopland because we have multiple years of GPS collar data and camera data to refer to. How can the changes in their movement and behavior compensate for the dramatic changes in landscape? We know that megafires are happening more and more often in California, and there may be the potential for black-tailed deer to compensate for some of these changes by making different movement and behavioral decisions. But at what point does that, adaptiveness get exhausted by the constantly growing and more frequent wildfires that are occurring? And then how do the changes that deer are using to compensate for wildfire affect other ecological interactions? So deer are the primary prey for mountain lions in this system. So if they make changes to their behavior and movement, it's going to directly affect how mountain lions are able to, use these areas as well. And then deer are also one of the primary browsers of oaks, or oak seedlings and saplings. So if deer are choosing to use different areas as well because of fire, that may also affect how oaks are able to regenerate over time as well. So to study the deer, we need to put the collars on them. So we use deer clover trapping to do that. We normally put collars out annually in the summer or early fall, and our collars are programmed to have a 1 hour fixed rate. So that means every hour, once we have the collar on the deer, it's sending a GPS location to a satellite where we can download that data to look at on a map where the deer was at that time. And the collars normally last for 1 year. So we get a lot of data, and we have a lot, like a breadth of data across time. I think we have about 90 deployments of collars from 2017 to 2021. So this spans both before the fire to about 2 years after the fire as well. So again, I wanted to touch on some initial hypotheses we have for this part of the project. Similarly with the cameras, I think that deer will probably use the low severity burn patches more so than the high severity patches for 2 reasons. One, because again, high severity burned areas are going to be super exposed, so that, you know, I probably wouldn't want to be a deer in the middle of just an open hillside waiting for a predator to get me. And then secondly, there's probably very little food resources left over after high severity burn. So they potentially are using areas that are low severity or unburned to get the food and other resources that they need. Secondly, I think deer will probably be less likely to use some of the more chaparral areas after the fire. For those who don't know, when chaparral burns, it burns like very high severity completely. So it's just a barren landscape, super exposed. And I expect deer to avoid those areas because they are so exposed. And then finally, deer may preferentially use some of the low to medium severity grassland and woodlands in the years following the fire, as what has been described as the magnet effect. So other researchers looked at patterns of ungulates and other herbivores and following wildfire in a way where in low severity wildfires, it returns a lot of the nutrition that was above ground to the soil, so that when it grows in the following year, it's like super nutritious, which is super attractive to a lot of deer and other ungulates in other parts of the world. Some of this work has already been completed by, we had a really cool undergrad who's now an alumni and now a grad student at UW, Sammy Krilling down here. She led a project with myself and then 2 other lab mates, Caitlin and Alex, looking at the initial responses of black-tailed deer to the same wildfire. What we found is that deer quickly leave their home ranges, but then they quickly return. So like within a day of the fire happening, most deer were back in their original home ranges. And we also found that deer remained pretty faithful to their original home range in the months following their return, but many deer, or most deer, double their home ranges within that burned area. So in this picture, I have an example of this deer K1. K1, this blue polygon is showing K1's home range before the fire, I think 2 months before the fire. And then this pink blob is showing K1's new home range in the months following the wildfire. And we think that this may be the deer's attempt to compensate for a lack of resources in their original home range without leaving their, without leaving their home range for a completely unburned area. So in this way, deer may have some adaptiveness in dealing with, dramatic changes to their landscape, but it's limited. This deer didn't completely leave Hopland. It's still trying to use its original space. I also found that deer are more likely to use woodland habitats. All right, so this next slide is probably my favorite slide. It's going to show each of the deer that we had GPS collars on in real time during the fire. So here it is. Each of these dots are one of the individual deer that have a GPS collar on it. And right now is when the fire is happening, so you can see they're running. Take a look at J3, this one. This one runs way away. I think it's super interesting to think about how each of the deer have kind of an individual response as well, on top of like this kind of population level response to wildfire as well. I think it's important to remember that for management implications as well. Let's see if it'll replay. Yeah, okay, I'll let it play one more time, or the beginning. Yep, that is the fire right there. Cool. So the next step for this project for me is to think about how habitat selection for these deer continues to change over time. So we know that they make these initial changes to deal or compensate for wildfire in the months following, but I'm really interested in understanding how long do these changes actually persist? Are deer able to return to their normal habitat usage 1, 2, 3 years following wildfire, or is this effect of wildfire something that's going to be much longer, or felt much longer across much greater timescales? So to do this, I'm hoping to use what's called a resource selection function that I'll walk through real quickly. I'm hoping to take it into account different covariates such as vegetation type, soil severity, NDVI, and ruggedness to get a better idea of where deer are selecting for habitat. So in this figure on the right, you can see this is like actual points for this K2 deer. The red dots are actual GPS locations for this deer, and the blue dots are randomly generated points that are within its home range. And we can use kind of this comparison of actual use and pseudo use, the blue dots, to find correlations between covariates like habitat type. So on here on this map, we have woodland, grassland, chaparral, versus where deer are actually avoiding areas. And what we've seen so far is that prior to the fire, deer showed very low vegetation type preferences. So deer would be in chaparral, woodland, or grassland, no preferences, and that they avoided stream beds and rugged areas, which are kind of prime predation areas for mountain lions. But post-fire, that changes, or at least some of it changes. Deer select slightly more for woodland habitat against chaparral or grassland, which makes sense if they're trying to find cover or other resources. And then deer continue to avoid the stream beds and rugged areas, so they're still avoiding predators. And then deer also avoid some of the high severity burned areas as well. So the next step is to look at whether or not these patterns persist 1 year after the fire. Are deer still avoiding these high severity areas? Are they, using chaparral and grassland areas more? How long does it take for them to return to their, pre-fire kind of behaviors? And then the kind of last layer of this is to look at how deer movement decisions, so very fine scale movement decisions, are dependent on where wildfires have happened and how severely they have burned. So this plot on the bottom is showing like the whole track of K2 for the entire, I think this is like 3 months of K2's movement GPS locations. And we can use this to get an idea of how their movement behaviors are moving across a burn landscape. So you can imagine this being just plopped onto this map and how these tracks might be affected by how severely different areas have burned. And these are very preliminary results. So this model is kind of taking into account 2 different behavioral states for these deer. So in one state, we characterize it as the deer resting or foraging. And in the second one, we think of it more as a quick directed movement. So these are showing transition probabilities. what's most important is this bottom half. So this is showing that the probability of going from a quick directed movement to a more resting state goes down as severity increases. So that means as deer walk into more severely burned areas, they're more likely to keep running through it. They don't want to be in them, which kind of corroborates some of the initial hypotheses that we had in the beginning. On top of this, we're hoping to color predators in the system so that we can see how the actual interactions of predation may be changing due to these changes in habitat by wildfire. So been trying to collar puma for like, I don't know, 3 years with little success so far, but we've had some success lately or recently in coloring coyotes at Hopland and looking at how those, hoping to look at how those movements may be changing in response to fire as well. And I wanted to end by kind of trying to bring these two pieces that I talk about together. And again, to really stress that it's important to understand how these dominant species like ungulates are using these systems because they are critical to like the food web and food chain in so many different directions. And especially if we think about oak woodlands overall, impacts to oak woodlands are really hard to understand because they operate over such vast timescales. It takes like 100 years for an oak to mature. So losing an oak from a wildfire may be felt for centuries, like literally. And I think that's all the more reason for us to be proactive about thinking about conservation in many of these systems and using fire management in a way that's effective that can prevent some of these really dramatic habitat changes. So I just want to quickly acknowledge my lab, the Brashares Lab, have been great and super supportive. I wouldn't have been able to do any of this work without them. Staff at ATREC as well, who've been super critical in helping me put on a lot of this work. And then also my funding. And I wanted to leave a quick note that I've been part of this group since I think last year, Black mammalogists that have kind of been pushing to increase representation in not just, you know, my field, but very broadly in ecology and mammalogy. We're having another event next month on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, please look out for us and look out for, notices about that event. I just want to end by saying thank you. And I have my contact in the top right and happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Kendall.
Yeah. Sorry, I ran a little long.
We're good. We've got a couple minutes. I'll just mention to folks that, you know, if there's anyone who needs to peel off before we get into the questions, you can always catch up on this discussion in the recording afterwards. But we do have a few questions here, so I figure we might as well just dig right into those. We'll take a few minutes. We probably won't run too many more minutes past 12, but we do want to put these over to Kendall. All right, so let's start with this one, Kendall, from Tim Ryan asks, these studies are taking place on the edge of the river fire perimeter. Question 1, do you think the proximity of unburned areas contributes to the perceived recovery of populations in the burned areas? And then follow-up question, are you aware of any similar studies that occur in the center of widespread high severity burned areas?
Yeah, these are good questions. So in some of the initial analyses, I did try to separate, I tried to include like a covariate of distance to burn so I could kind of try to control for the proximity of the unburned areas to the burned areas. But this may be because I don't have enough camera sites independently to look at that effect, but I couldn't find a strong signal that connected distance to whether or not different animal populations were recovering, or like the probability of a species being present as a factor of the distance to the burn. Does that make sense? I think that maybe that's why I'm hoping to include more sites in like future studies so that I can get more independent kind of replicates to look at that effect really closely. Because I do think that probably is important for at least some of the species, like especially the more mobile ones. If you remember that like deer summary detection chart, where it looked like there were more deer, like deer in the unburned areas looked like their number of detections actually increased following the wildfire. That might be because deer are moving at the edge from the burned areas to the unburned areas, but we don't have kind of like enough data to say that for sure. And then are you aware studies? I am of for birds. There are a lot of bird studies, especially in like the Sierras, that look at kind of the central, or they look at high severity burn areas as a kind of interaction with distance to unburned areas. So kind of what I was saying before and what I would like to do, but not for wildlife, or not, sorry, not for camera traps yet.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then the second question here is, does the Hopland Center share their wildfire data with those who are making decisions about land management policy and funding? It seems so important that funding needs to be more directly related to the evolving scientific data.
Yeah, so that was asking if like the data is kind of available, or the wildfire data, not the what.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this was from an anonymous attendee, but I'm wondering if that person could clarify if they mean wildfire data or wildlife data, or the combination of the two, like what Kendall was presenting here.
Well, I can kind of, I guess I could say that I know that, so right now the wildlife data isn't like publicly available, and kind of the only way we can communicate that is through science publications or outreach like this, or like a research brief. But I'd love to make, and this is something that I think CVFW is kind of pushing through Wildlife Insights, making like a database of camera trap data like available very openly for everyone, so that we can actually look at the effects of wildfire, habitat degradation, like other types of global change pressures very broadly, in a way that's easy to acquire the data. I don't know if that completely answers that question, but, and if the question was about wildfire data, I think CAL FIRE records all of the actual like fire perimeter severity data, which is publicly accessible.
Yeah. There was a question in the chat that I don't want to overlook. I'm seeing we have another one in the Q&A box, but this one goes back to some of the first graphs you were sharing regarding the drop in squirrel detections. Do you think it's possible that it reflects an actual drop in the squirrel population due to decrease in food availability, or because they couldn't get out of the way of the fire?
Oh, that's a tricky question. So with the cameras, it's really hard to get at population level questions like numbers of species, numbers of individuals, because unless the individuals are marked, we actually don't know if it's like we're not super sure if it's the same squirrel like running back and forth across the camera. Very unlikely, but it's possible. I would say that it's probably more likely for squirrels and other small species that if they're detected less, it probably does mean that there's some kind of change in abundance potentially, or number of individuals. Whereas I wouldn't say that because lions are not being detected more often in an area, I don't think that means that there are less lions. It just means the lions aren't using that area. But for squirrels and other small species, that's definitely kind of what I think is the case. Especially for gray squirrels that are arboreal, they're not going to run underground like a ground squirrel to like escape the flames. They don't really have anywhere to run if their tree is on fire. So very likely that there was some mortality. Oh, I think you muted.
I am muted. I was just rambling about like the wildlife camera issue with you can't count individuals with any certainty. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple more questions that I want to direct your way. One is going back to the deer. And I think it says, did you have GPS markers on the deer before the fires? And I believe the answer is yes. Based on that graphic you shared, they had the collars on and then the fire happened and then you could see them moving around.
Right.
But I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, I think that year we had just put the collars on like beginning of July and the fire happened like end of July. So very close.
Just in
like,
time, yeah. And then do you have a sense of where the deer went to escape the fire? And did you find any wildlife corridors from looking at this?
I don't know. I haven't looked specifically at whether or not we found wildlife corridors, although that'd be really interesting. Like, are there ways that deer know to use to escape? As you saw, a lot of it looked like the deer make very independent decisions of where to go. Like some just run way out of the way. And I think at least one deer runs towards like Highway 101. Yeah, I think they go, and then some deer actually make like very small movement decisions, probably like directly avoiding flames without running too far away. So there's a breadth of different kind of behaviors, I think, in that example. And it seems, at least from our collared deer, there were no mortalities. So whatever they're doing worked to avoid at least the initial kind of effect of fire.
Great. All right. And then I have one last question here, and I think we'll wrap it up after that. Are you actively investigating or planning how to explore low severity fire treatments, such as cultural or prescribed fire, in addition to high severity versus unburned?
Not at the moment. I had started thinking, it's kind of a long story. So I had wanted to do wildlife research at Hopland originally to look at the effects of prescribed burning, which is kind of that low severity wildfire in oak woodland specifically. And it just happened that this really giant fire happened at Hopland as we were kind of planning that study. So I think I am not currently, but I think it is an important piece to understand, especially if we're trying to reintroduce prescribed burning into a lot of these oak woodland systems. Although I think at least part of my research might suggest that these low severity fires probably don't impact the responses of these mammal species too much. Most of them seem resistant or resilient to severe wildfire. So the low severity fires are probably also, if nothing else, beneficial for a lot of those species.
Yeah, that's a good point. Great. Oh, let me see, we got one new message. Lots of thank yous and positive comments in the chat there, Kendall, if you have the chance to go through that. And on that note, I would also like to share with everyone that when you leave today's Zoom meeting, a little short survey will pop up in your browser. If you have feedback you want to give us, that would be a great place to put that. Very much appreciate it. And yeah, I just want to thank you again, Kendall, for a great presentation, and point out to everyone that the recording will be sent out for this one. And if you want to check out the recordings from our past webinars, you can find those on our YouTube channel. Our next in this series will be next week, Being with Bears, centered on the North Bay Bear Collaborative with Megan Walla-Murphy. And then a couple of upcoming events that I thought folks might be interested in person at Pepperwood. In February, we'll be doing a forest stewardship workshop. And then in March, we will have an animal tracking workshop. Both of those are in person, and there's still space in them, so you can register on our website. And with that, I'd love to say, stay in touch, follow us on social media, subscribe. You can keep updated on all the latest, find out about upcoming events. And yeah, we want to thank you all for being here.